So 3, the next movement in action is conducting the audit. Conducting an audit for an accessibility guide, especially when we're talking about massive conference sites, can be extremely intense. So just want to foreground that, sort of helpful to think ahead about what this experience might be and prepare yourselves to meet your own needs in the moment as you're actually doing the audit. But one thing I want to say is this is not something that typically can happen in a couple of hours. In fact, both times I did an accessibility guide, I was there for an initial audit well over 6 hours, and it felt like I was so exhausted and really tired. And I ended up going back for a second and sometimes a third pass. So I think that's just good to wrap your head around, that this will take a few goes to do. So relatedly, Katie has helped me notice and think through the fact that a lot of times you do need to get access to the spaces that you want to audit. So in my case, this was about making appointments with event staff that were associated with the hotel's conference spaces that were going to be used. So I hope this helps to know for planning these multiple passes that you might do for an accessibility guide. So for example, I didn't even try to do the lobby. I didn't even try to do the hotel restaurants for the time when I was going with the event coordinator to check out the conference spaces that I needed her to be able to even see. So I only focused on those spaces that I needed access to, and I saved the more publicly accessible areas for another chunk of auditing. That's one sort of piece of advice, to just think about what you need someone to even access. And in the process of trying to break the audit down a bit, you could consider holding some of the more public spaces for another chunk. Okay, as for the audit itself, it is so much information. That's really just worth preparing yourself for. Prepare to take a lot of notes. It helps to take as many notes as you possibly can. This is another reason it can be helpful to have a buddy for the audit. Take as many photographs as you're able to. I was taking photographs of the sink area in every bathroom, the accessible stall, and I'm making air quotes, in every bathroom. Sometimes accessible stalls are not all the same amount of accessible. Make sure you are labeling your notes with the location that you are writing details down about. This might seem really obvious, but that's what made it possible for me to go back to my frantically scribbled notes and use them, is I knew this was information about Illinois room in the conference center. A few more tips. First, it can be really helpful to bring a measuring tape with you. That will help you get really specific information, especially where it's looking a little dicey accessibility-wise, but you're not sure for whom it would be accessible and for whom it would be a deal breaker. So it can be helpful to know this is a 33-inch entrance, and so on and so forth. Another piece of advice that I have for everyone is having somebody with you. As we've mentioned a few times in a few ways, having someone with you can really help for noticing things that you might not have noticed all by yourself. So I think Ruth gave this great example of someone on Ruth's team helping Ruth notice that having prayer rooms is a form of accessibility that the guide should be attending to. I know that in my experience, I was touring with somebody who was blind, and they taught me all about how elevators might beep at each floor, and really great elevators would announce the floor. And that's something that, as a deaf person, I wouldn't even necessarily hear all the time. And it was also something that I hadn't learned yet to think about. So having people with you It's always a great idea if you can manage it. And then, right, so relatedly, I have another tip. It can be really helpful to think about the people that you take with you and their access needs, including your own access need. So keeping in mind that doing an audit can be a relatively physical endeavor that involves covering a lot of ground, reviewing entrances, reviewing bathrooms, reviewing meeting rooms, looking at the flooring, look at the lighting, looking at navigation. It's really worth explaining that to people that you're inviting to join you so that they can think through their access needs, both in terms of physical access. Also, it can be kind of overstimulating. So they may want to think through just their relationship to the process and what they may need. And kind of back to one of my previous thoughts, if you need someone to access the spaces, you might have less control over how quickly you try to do it. If you are doing some chunk where it's a publicly available area of the conference site, then you might have more control over, okay, we're only going to try to do this much. We're going to take breaks, so on and so forth. So that is another thing that I encourage you all to think about. And then I believe I have two more pieces of advice in this section. First, we mentioned this in the article, but a lot of learning what to notice that's one of the biggest learning curves for doing the audit itself. And there are some wonderful worksheets out there in the world that can help you organize a list of things that you are trying to notice and make notes about. And then final piece of advice, when I talked to the access guide writers that had come before me, they told me to take a lot of notes and write them up as soon as possible after the audit so your memory is fresh. I didn't do that. And I completely recognize the value of this advice. So I will repeat, if at all possible, plan ahead so that you have the spoons and you have time set aside to write up your note as soon as possible. Because the sooner you do that, the sooner you can ask other people to help you with composing the guide.
If I could add, the importance of auditing the virtual and digital spaces too is so important, and I think really easy to overlook. If you can, ask if you can like sit on whatever group is evaluating or looking at what tech platform they might use. If your conference or event is using a tech platform, try to get to know it really well. Send all the annoying messages to the tech platform people, right? With all these questions about access, try to get a good understanding of how these things work as far ahead of time as you can. A thing I noticed when we started was it seemed the tech platform was very much not on top of access. So it was in some ways coaching the tech company in access, which shouldn't have been conference goers' jobs. But it also became like trying to help other conference goers find back channels for access and trying to write that into the guide itself. Like kind humans, I know these are not features of the tech platform, but here are ways we can provide access to each other, kind of written up in the guide, right? In the instructions for posting your materials, in the instructions for how we're going to, host virtual sessions, trying to build in access as well as you can in the virtual and digital spaces.
And I'll jump in as well because I had a situation where I couldn't access the space. And so taking what Ada and Margaret was saying and kind of putting it together with the building a team of I had to rely heavily on the staff and like articulating them through email what I needed. And it just was that process. And without the help from the campus staff, I wouldn't have been able to get some of the photos and the layout of things the measurements of things that I needed for my accessibility guide. And so if you don't have access to space, because in my case, students were living in the dorms, and so they wouldn't allow me to go in and look at them, learning how to navigate that in ways that then you can still get the information is still possible. It just takes different ways to think about it.